Daniel, thanks for being here with us. I believe that many of the people who follow your work are very interested in the small provocations or critiques that you make about contemporary political communication, or as you say it, a field that is more like white Western political communication. So could you share with us some of these critiques that you've made in your latest research?
I'm interested in advancing because I'm interested in how do we create more robust social scientific knowledge that allows for a much fuller understanding of the political world that we inhabit. So I would point to a few different things. So first of all, I would say there was presumption to consolidated democracies
Mm,
and very little consideration of ways in which that post-war liberal democratic consensus that existed in the US and Europe after World War II could ever become undermined or threatened
mm,
or actually deconsolidated or backsliding
mm,
or leading to backsliding in various ways, right? So there was sort of this presumption that the political system would exist through time immemorial
mm,
and not be undermined in various ways. Relating to that is there was a deep presumption by both US and European scholars that the countries they were operating in were, in fact, democratic, right?
mm,
In the US's case, this overlooked really the fact that the United States was not established as a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy until at least the 1960s with the passage of the Civil Rights Act. I would argue was never fully consolidated, and in fact, I think you see that now
mm,
in arguments and debates, not just around race and ethnicity, but over things such as immigration, both in the U.S. and Europe. I think European scholars overlooked, in addition to American scholars, their country's histories of colonialism and empire and ways in which the consolidated democracies that they were studying at home certainly did not look that way abroad in the territories that they had colonized or that they had holdings in various ways. Um, I think relating to all this, the field has not studied or understood well social difference and social power,
mm,
right? And when I say social difference and social power, I both mean identity, right, which the field has slowly been turning to in the last decade. I think particularly with the growth of the far right and various nativist elements shaping political systems, including debates over things like immigration. But I also mean just ways in which social identities map onto social structures and how
mm,
groups occupy different positions in social structures, right? So some groups have more power than others,
mm,
right? People who look like me, white men, for instance, have long been at the top
mm,
of their nation's hierarchies, and institutions have been working for them in various ways. Representation has worked for them in various ways. That has left out women in the public sphere. It has also left out non-white people. It has also left out, we can think about like distinctions on the basis of religion, on class, right?
mm,
On sexual and gender identity, on nation of origin, right? So, like, all these things also are something that historically political communication scholars have not been very attuned to. And I think
mm,
the last thing that I would say on this, but that runs throughout, is that question of power, right? Who has
mm,
power? Who holds it? How political communication works to either entrench or challenge certain arrangements of power
mm.
that certain groups benefit from in various ways. I know that was a long-winded response to your question, but it was a big question. I hope I didn't go overboard.
Um, I would like to start with a small provocation myself that is related
Yeah,
to what you said. I'm gonna read a small fragment of the book Sensing Collectives, Studying and Political Practices Intertwined. Um, and I'll ask you what you think about it.
yeah.
The main tenets of Occidental philosophy and modern culture have been that politics should remain above sensibilities and feelings. It ought to pursue sober analysis, rational argumentation, and deal primarily with serious controversy for the collective good. this is interesting, right? Because you've written a lot about how we assume that our publics are rational, they seek deliberation, they are willing, not just able, but like willing to engage in rational, lengthy debates. And this has obscured, it's not that it is not true, it is that it doesn't apply. It is not the only way we relate to politics. It has obscured other ways of analyzing and understanding individual and collective identities.
Yeah, I guess I would draw a distinction between a set of empirical claims about the role of things like emotion and identity in politics, and a set of normative claims about the role and of emotions and identity in politics. In terms of empirically, you're exactly right, right? So one of the things that I've made a hallmark of writing against over the last decade are pointing out all the ways in which people's identities, storytelling that's not about rational deliberation around evidence, for instance, people's identities, what they come to see as true and as not true on the basis of emotion and instinct, and group loyalties, etc., are actually much closer to the way that politics actually works from a lived and felt and experienced level, right? And I think when you frame it in that way, what you start to see really is the appeal of politics in all sorts of ways that are about sense making and telling stories about the world that people are in and how they inhabit it, and making appeals, identity-based appeals, to support from political candidates, or making group-based appeals, or doing that identity work itself to get people to see themselves in certain ways, in order for them to derive either group-based benefits or for politicians to derive benefits from that. So as an empirical matter, I think the rationalist story was never quite a compelling one in terms of capturing how the world actually works in the context of politics. Now, the normative question is different, right? And the question there is, right, should we have a rationalist politics, one where we bracket off our identities and our emotions from the public sphere, in the service of that reasoned deliberation and public debate? And there's been a robust argument about this going on for a very long time. My own view would be that not only is that not possible, but it's not necessarily desirable either. I think if you look at sort of the long history about these sorts of debates, they've long been used in deeply exclusionary terms to say that certain styles of political argumentation, certain standards of evidence are in fact what is right and good and true, and other people's ways of knowing the world are in fact invalid. We've seen ways in which claims of people being emotional have been weaponized against women, against racial and ethnic minorities, against people who don't have the same level of education or training or skills, that higher ed prepares them for in certain ways. And we have said all the ways in which that is illegitimate in terms of bringing that into the sphere. So I would argue that actually we should have a wide range of normatively desirable styles of political communication that we bring into the public sphere. And that what we should be focusing on are political values, the values that we should share as members of democratic societies, or as societies that are striving to be more fully democratic and more fully just and more fully free and more fully equal. And that within that, if we can come up with the values, that we can have a range of different ways of interacting with one another in the context of various forms of institutional politics, that we don't need to artificially delimit it in terms of a constrained rationality. And the last thing that I'll just add too, I mean, if you were to take identity and emotion out of the equation, many of our most powerful movements for social justice over the last century would be taken off the table as being legitimate forms. You can't think of a civil rights movement in the United States without thinking about the ways that identity and emotion and storytelling and values have played a central role in American politics. You can't think about the global Me Too movement without also thinking about it on those terms. Roads Must Fall or Black Lives Matter, right? All of which work through networks of affect on social media that gave rise to this extraordinarily powerful witnessing by people who had historically been excluded from certain positions of power and from full participation in the public sphere. It would strike me as deeply limiting to say that that's not legitimate forms of political engagement, because holding power to account can also and often be a process that engages emotions and values and morals, and that urges and spurs people to action and participate.
That links very well to your work on polarization and how we tend to assume that all affective polarization is negative. And we've had so many debates about this in our own seminars. Okay, polarization makes it seem like the truth is at the center, and any extremist view is dangerous. Oh, the far right is very dangerous, but the far left is equally dangerous. And if we assume that, exactly how are we gonna encourage social movements, marginalized groups to take a voice and make changes? So is effective polarization necessarily negative? Is it bad for democracy?
I think what we need to remember about polarization is that it is a value neutral term, right? In itself, it explains empirically some continuum or line or poles that represent various forms of either feeling or debate or policy preferences, right? There's many different forms of polarization. It could be affective in the way that we feel towards one another. It can be ideological polarization. It can be policy polarization. It can even be moral polarization, right? But it says absolutely nothing about how we evaluate the poles themselves, right? And how we should, as scholars, as researchers, but also as citizens and as human beings in the world, how we should evaluate how people are positioned with respect to their political beliefs, their attitudes, etc. And I think the challenge is you can't say effective polarization is bad without actually evaluating the positions, the identities, the values that various groups hold with respect to some sort of standard that you would evaluate them based on. So for me, it would be, for one example would be small d democracy, right? So if we start from the perspective of democracy is good, and we can define that in a million ways, as we know, but like at a minimum, right? Free and fair elections are good. Equality under the law is good. Democratic inclusion of people, regardless of their identities or their religious orientations, is a good, right? How would we evaluate groups then that are different with respect to that basic stance towards democracy, right? So to take the example, right? So oftentimes the civil rights movement in the United States, I'm an Americanist, sorry, was accused of being polarizing because they were pushing for full inclusion in that small d democratic structure or life in the United States. Right? In that context, we would never say polarization is bad. We would say what is bad is that there's a center in the United States that looks to deny fully equal participation and rights for some groups of people on the basis of racial exclusion in the United States, right? So regardless of how people felt towards one another, that's not the problem. The problem is that some people are being excluded from full participation and full rights in a democratic system of government, right? And in that context, I would say affective polarization is often the byproduct of various groups that are striving for full inclusion on any varying number of measures, right? And I think that's why we see it in our own time. I think what you see driving a lot of far right movements around the world, certainly in my own country, is actually backlash. It's not polarization in the sense that people are just pitted against one another and have negative feelings towards one another for no reason at all. It's because there is a long dominant established order of whites and white Christians and white Christian males in the United States that both perceive and actually on an empirical basis experience their role at the top of that order being eroded in various ways. The country is growing more diverse. Their hold on political, social, and institutional power and cultural power is not what it once was 30, 40 years ago. In very real senses, varying outgroups have gained vis-a-vis those groups. Now, is polarization between those groups bad, or is what's bad that certain groups have long enjoyed outsized power in a supposedly democratic political system? I would say the latter, right? And I think what you see is actually backlash to those gains for racial, social, and religious equality that have been taking shape in the United States. The problem is the backlash because it violates democratic tenets of equality under the law, of flourishing, of justice, whatever standard of democratic values you would look like. The polarization is not the problem in this context.
I think it links very well as well to your concept of counter-publics and defensive publics, right?
Yeah.
This idea of threatened identities that are reacting and seeking, let's say, a sort of like collective attachment that gives them power, defense, not that gives them power, that helps them consolidate and keep the power. They're seeking to stay in power, they're seeking stability. So could you explain a little bit more why defensive publics are not counter-publics?
Sure. And first of all, thank you for engaging so closely with my work. I mean, this is kind of extraordinary, to be honest. I don't know anyone who's like read all this stuff before, so I appreciate that. And the questions are great. Yeah, so I mean, I can talk about the origin maybe of that project just because I think it illustrates a lot of what we were thinking about. And also some of the gaps in the field that we started talking about, right? So Sarah Jackson, professor at UPenn Annenberg, and I sort of had noticed in and around various conferences, such as the American Political Science Association, that researchers were referring to far-right groups as counter-publics. And this was concerning to us because the whole idea originally of counter-publics that grew up in the literature by feminist scholars, by Black feminist scholars, by Black studies scholars, etc., grew up this idea of counter with respect to defining a powerful and dominant center, right? And then thinking through groups that were struggling to either gain inclusion or have accountability over or have self-determination within, right, a dominant particular center, right? So if you think about some of the famous writings that have been done in the counter-public tradition, it was about women seeking to gain entry into the public sphere. It was about Black people in the United States seeking to gain entry to the public sphere. It was about people who were comparatively low in socioeconomic class, right? For instance, fighting to gain public into a dominant public sphere. In that sense, it is truly counter, right? In the sense of being opposed to some relations or structures of dominance in the groups that inhabit those positions of power. Extending that to the far right in various countries, to us, was a mistake, right? Because regardless of whether the far right might differ on some varying levels of political style, or even be taken to more extreme, if you actually look historically, the positions that the far right holds, both in the United States and in varying countries in Europe, and we don't have to go down the rabbit hole of how I'm defining the far right, but in general, the far right as being groups that either reject democracy or reject varying tenets of liberal democracy in terms of equality of varying groups based in certain ways on ascriptive hierarchies. But if you look historically, those far right groups were much more aligned with the historical center of countries within Europe as well as the United States on any one of a number of grounds, right? So in Europe, you would look and you would say they definitely, or they espouse themselves with Christian nationalism in various ways, with a very constrained notion of what makes a European, right? In rejecting racial or ethnic diversity existing at least on the European continent itself, to say nothing about their colonies, right? So on all and traditional gender roles in various ways. In the U.S., of course, it looks a little bit different, but certainly our big one is on race and ethnicity, as well as white Christian publics holding power. So even again, even though the far right is a more recent sort of resurgent backlash-fed phenomenon, again, if you look about how they've been aligned as a set of groups with which groups have been historically dominant within those countries, it makes no sense to call them counter at all. And if you put it through the lens of backlash, what you actually see is they're actually looking to take more extreme measures to defend those historical social structures through which they have benefited as a set of groups, when institutions are arranged to work for them, when politics is arranged to work for them, when culture and society is arranged and the economy is arranged to work for them. So that's why we thought that the term defensive just better captured how power was actually working in this space, as opposed to what we felt like was the political communication field's attempt to collapse power and then to sort of say, well, there is this center that's defined by this set of political styles or agreed upon arguments, but we're not going to make any attempt to actually analyze how groups are positioned vis-a-vis that center.
That's wonderful, and it made me think of Rancière, right? And how he would defend a counter publics, and it would definitely not include the far right. And it's very interesting how they have co-opted rebelliousness. People like Donald Trump or Javier Milei in Argentina, they co-opt rebelliousness. They present themselves as being countercultural, as being cool, the new cool, right?
100%.
Representing young people's need to break with the system, to implement radical change.
On your last point, I just wanted to say, I mean, I have a 7-year-old boy, right? And to your point about sort of the ways in which historically dominant styles have been framed as countercultural, I mean, I see it all the time. Like the absolute, in my opinion, the most dominating forms of masculinity and violent forms of masculinity as they are repackaged, I see all over the place here, right? Like it's like that, the undertone of violence, the undertone of like what being a man is, and a very constrained form that is presented as something radically new and freeing from politically correctness, etc. But that up until 50 years ago was like the dominant political style for men that we've moved away from, in my view, for good reasons, right? Because like we've expanded our public sphere, we've expanded empathy and respect and collaboration and participation, like all those values. But to just see that on its rise and being, again, sold as something that's new and cool and different, that's deeply, very much going back to sort of the worst days of my childhood, is just extraordinary. It's all over the popular culture. You know, it plays into gender and sexual identity. I mean, it's in any event.
You've written before about how political communication is ill-equipped to understand the far right, illiberalism, those threats to the same democracy we took for granted, and we thought everybody agreed upon. Could you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think this is very much all the themes that we've been sort of talking about, right? So, one thing political communication historically has not done well is understood the histories within which political communication is embedded, right? So this goes back to that defensive publics idea, right? So, and if you don't understand a history of power and how the present is indelibly shaped by that history, that it's
Mhm.
really hard to understand how certain groups are positioned both vis-a-vis power and then taking certain strategies in order how to achieve it, right?
Mhm.
So that would be the first thing I would say. A second thing would be political communication generally lacks a language for social structure, right?
Mhm.
Like we sort of assert things when it comes to, I mean, I think our most developed literature is really on the role of women in politics. But we have very little work on the role of men
Mhm.
in politics and masculine styles in politics.
Mhm.
Um, we do our best when we sort of conceptualize that there are inequalities. For instance, it could be the double standard when women campaign for office. It could be
Mhm.
inequalities with how women are represented when it comes to formal political institutions and bodies, et cetera. We have our deepest language for that, but we don't have a detailed analysis or a full set of a fuller understanding of all the other ways that like the world is not just collapsed to certain performances of gender, right? We have very
Mhm.
little understanding of things like class. We have very little understandings of things like race. We have very little understanding of
Mhm.
things like ethnicity. We're doing better when it comes to things
Mhm.
like immigration and debates over immigration, particularly in the context of the far right. But all these things the far right is organizing around, right, and making those identity appeals. It's not just gender roles, but it's also a constructed sense of what national religions and national identities should be.
Mhm.
It's a sense of what normative gender identities should be. It's a
Mhm.
constructed sense of what racial and ethnic identities should be in
Mhm.
certain ways that get mapped onto power in various ways. All which the far right organizes around and tells a story around. Um, I'll say in general, the field also kind of has a value neutrality to it. That at its worst, I would say it sort of collapses all political life into a descriptivism, right?
Mhm.
To sort of say this is what's happening without any real attempt to analyze
Mhm.
or interrogate or critique what's happening
Mhm.
on the normative grounds. And I think this is exactly the piece with the far right is that if we can't clearly name and call out what's problematic from a democratic perspective, right? And we don't develop a language for that about why it violates certain tenets of inequality or flourishing
Mhm.
or human dignity, et cetera. Well, then how can we expect citizens or anyone else to think about those things, right?
Mhm.
Because we should be well positioned to tell that story and do that sense making in a way that interrogates those forms of power. Um, and I believe that the field is constantly making normative claims.
Mhm.
It's inevitable in social science, but we just don't always do so explicitly, right?
Mhm.
And I think we need a new interrogation of those things that are worth defending or advocating or trying to advance in various
Mhm.
ways, and a clearly fleshed out body of work that does that in a coherent way.
Mhm. Yeah, maybe there is certain claims to neutrality, I guess. Also, not just in journalism, but also in academia. There's a body of scholars who used to work about populism and they stopped calling
Yeah,
it populism because by saying populism, it seems like you're obscuring other things. There's a very famous work by Aurélien Mondon, and he looks at
yeah,
academic publications on populism and how few, I think it was like less than 10% mention race or racial inequality.
exactly. That's right.
So if we as scholars are not reflecting upon that, right?
Yep.
What the focus of our research is, which words we're using, which words become trendy, and which terms get obscured. Of course, how are we going to ask the media to do it?
Exactly. Yeah, and
Probably.
polarization became the new populism, right?
Mhm.
Like the
Yeah.
minute populism started to go out of favor for exactly all those reasons that it didn't
Mhm.
account for race, it didn't account for positions in a social structure, like polarization took off because it's a
Mhm.
non-political way to talk about politics. right?
Mm,
And then that gets adopted into media worlds and foundation funders, right? Because it's easy. It's easy to just decry polarization and blame social media companies for it. It's
mhm,
much harder to say, right, this is actually about backlash based on some
mhm,
dominant groups,
mhm.
and certain parties represent that more than others.
Yes, I think I attended a presentation by Aurélien Mondon. He was talking about the populist hype, the polarization hype, the liberal hype, and how those are also quite simplistic ways of analyzing very complex phenomena, and we tend to reproduce them in academia. Great. You've talked a little bit as well about how a lot of research on political communication was driven by political psychology and focused on individuals and their values, cognition, knowledge. While there's little research on groups and structures, and I think you have a recent publication that defends a more group-based focus on political communication.
Well done. It just came out. Good job.
Great. Because I didn't have time to read that, could you explain that
Yeah.
a little bit more and we can wrap up after that?
Yeah, sure. Well, anyway, again, kudos to you for knowing everything. You have gone above and beyond. But yeah, so I mean, this is actually a really great collaboration. It was with my colleague Shannon McGregor, who we've been writing together for years. But also two psychologists, Dan Lane and
Mhm.
Stuart Coles,
Ah,
both American psychologists, and deep experimentalists, like that can, canonically social scientific trained experimentalists representing the political psychology traditions.
mhm.
Um, at least in the United States, but certainly in Europe as well. And they had been writing about race and ethnicity. And in fact, one of the amazing pieces of their contribution is, for whatever reason, over the last 5 years, I've grown much more to be writing more theoretical and conceptual works, even though I started out my career as a much more radical empiricist. And again, sort of a more canonically trained social scientist. Doing mixed methods work, et cetera. But so they tested a lot of stuff that Chad and I were writing about, which made it such a fun collaboration. But we sort of realized the one barrier that was holding the field back was that everything about our current political moment was being shoehorned into theories of identity, social identity theory that date back 50, 60 years,
Mhm.
right? And it's like all of a sudden, the field sort of found identity, reached back into the past, took this idea of identity that existed in social identity theory in various
Mhm.
quarters of political science, and just started to apply it to our world almost uncritically in various ways,
Mhm.
right? And it was stunning on a few levels. We have a need for new theory, right? Like, let's just say that up front. At least in canonical paradigmatic center of the field work.
Mhm.
That's not everywhere. There certainly is a lot more work that exists in critical studies in European traditions, political science, etc. So this orientation of identity was holding us back on a few levels. One, it was deeply individualist in orientation, right? So it's sort of like
Mhm.
identities just exist in people's heads.
Mhm.
So it was one of those foundational claims, and then they're somewhat arbitrary too, right? Like people just kind of affiliate with certain things in various ways. The second thing is that there was sort of this argument that there was no necessary basis of why people would affiliate with one identity and not others, right? And you see this all over the polarization literature, right?
Mhm.
They sort of treat polarization between groups as essentially meaningless. They're accidents,
Mhm.
and that's why it's so destructive or damaging to politics. So what we wanted to do is actually try to advance something that looked a little bit different, which is to
Mhm.
say it's actually groups that come first, and then people derive identity from various groups that exist in the world. Now, to a sociologist, this is like, we've known this for 150 years. Why is this new, right? But I think this is like one of the things that's really useful to do when you speak from a field is to bring things in from
Mhm.
other places that have better answers to the questions that you're trying to ask, or have better ways of sort of conceptualizing a present moment.
Mhm.
And in this context, like we pulled in a lot of work from within sociology, from race and ethnic studies, from critical studies, et cetera, to try to build out like what would a political communication theory of groups look like.
Mhm.
One that took power seriously, right?
Mhm.
Because you have to consider how groups, not identities, but
Mhm.
groups are arranged in various social structures, right? So groups helps you see power better.
Mhm.
Groups, and a perspective on groups helps you understand where identities come from much better. And then when we think about groups, it leads us to thinking about political institutions and political processes better.
Mhm.
People don't engage in politics on an individual basis.
Mhm.
They engage in politics from a perspective of groups, the groups
Mhm.
that represent them, the groups that they affiliate with, the groups that their parties or coalitions in, the groups that they derive benefit from being a part of, right? And one important way that politics works is by making appeals to various groups. Groups are
Mhm.
going to benefit, right, from this membership organization or this advocacy organization or this president or congressman or prime minister, right? They constantly make appeals to construct group identity and then to say that certain groups will benefit from that. And of course, nations are groups too, just at a larger scale
Mhm.
of analysis, right? So
Mhm.
if we actually took the group as a starting point and not an individual identity as a
Mhm.
starting point, we argue it just gives you a fuller view on the political moment and a wider range of things to study from a political
Mhm.
communication perspective. We're not saying get rid of an individualist orientation or get rid
Mhm.
of experiments or political psychology.
Mhm.
It's simply to say that anything that you're doing at this level of analysis, you have to scale up and also think
Mhm.
about how the individual is related in a social structure to other people like them, and then how
Mhm.
that relates to a political institutional structure, a media system structure, et cetera.
That's wonderful. That's very interesting because when we think about contemporary political campaigns, we always think about micro-targeting, and we believe this
Yeah,
micro-targeting is really micro, it targets the individual while it might target groups, it might be micro-targeting through different identity-based groups. Um,
exactly. And even the most sophisticated marketing,
mhm,
micro targeting, which I
mhm.
started my career writing about, is
Yes.
not personalizing things to individuals, but
Mhm,
it's making probabilistic assessments that certain individuals
mhm,
look like other individuals because
mhm,
they're micro targeting to aggregates, right?
mhm,
And it's those aggregates as revealed through social media behavior and other forms of data that then
mhm.
constitutes the actual basis of micro targeting. So you're right, you're 100% right. It's a much better way to think about how micro targeting actually works as a practice.
I don't want to end the interview without asking you about my other topic of interest this last month, which is the Mamdani phenomenon in the United
Yeah,
States.
talk about a vibe. Yeah.
About Mandami's vibe, about his way of appealing to various identity-based groups, right? And not just individuals, like door knocking
Yeah.
and media savvy, use of digital vernaculars, and how it kind of drew a lot of European political strategists, left-wing leaders to New York to learn from this. Do you think we're into something new? Do you think?
I
Yeah.
don't. I really don't. And
Oh, no.
so I would say the reason why I would say I don't think it's distinctly new, it's because theoretically, and again, this is sort of where I more started my
Mhm.
career, and other people have written about this.
Mhm.
But you know, anytime a candidate like that is successful, it's sort of this intersection of the context and the moment,
Mhm.
the person themselves in terms of how they stylize their biography, their style, their embodied
Mhm.
person, right? How they perform their practice in the world.
Mhm.
And then it's the message and the space that they carve out vis-a-vis other candidates, other social forces. And all of those things have to align to create resonance, right? And I think that's what Mamdani very much did, right? So he played the hands that he was dealt really well. He was a candidate for the moment, who was coming up in a context with a very strong critique and anxiety over President Trump, right? Very strong class basis and opening for a class-based argument. That also had a cultural moment for various forms of appeals to identity and ethnic groups. And then he also used media extremely savvy to deliver that message and to perform the candidate's own their personality, right? Their genre, who they are, how they lived, etc. So all those things came together in the same way they all came together in 2008 with Barack Obama, right? Like you could argue in the same way they came together for Bernie Sanders in 2016, even though he was less successful. So if we think about those elements, the elements of like the context, the field, the person, the practice, the performance, as well as the electorate and the other groups, I don't think that's new. What is, right? So like you could adopt the exact same techniques that Mamdani did in Georgia and be horribly unsuccessful, or Paris and be horribly unsuccessful, right? So it's not just the tactics, although you have to think through like what moment are you meeting, what message meets that moment, what groups exist, and then perform your media in a way that then is resonant with people. And I think that's what Mamdani did really well. And that's what made him so exciting, I think, to so many people. But I think it tells you a lot about where the US politics is at. I think this politics of class, but a politics of class that doesn't get rid of the fact, right, that people are also part of racial, ethnic, citizenship status groups, right, that are differentially positioned vis-a-vis class. That, to me, is what the Democratic Party, right, or the lesson of where the Democratic Party is at this particular moment in time. And will it work outside of New York City? I think it will, but it will be more challenging to do than in ways of what Mamdani did.
Okay, so we'll stay tuned to the next elections. Thanks so much for the conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Of course. And next time we'll do it in Spain.